For more on the economy, we're joined by Brian Fabbri. He's chief economist of North America at BNP Paribas. Based on data compiled by Bloomberg, he actually is one of the most accurate predictors of the economy, and he was, in fact, the most accurate on GDP in the first quarter. We call him a Bloomberg best. Brian, thank you so much for joining us. After Mike talking about how difficult it is to predict GDP, I mean, do you think that your job has gotten tougher this year, considering how mixed the data has been?
First, I admit that it's a very uncertain science, and let that be said. I think there's a couple of thoughts that I'd share with you. First of all, forecasts for quarter-on-quarter growth are very difficult and indeed may not be as inspiring for investors or even policymakers as, let's say, year-on-year growth forecasts might be. And I think economists in general have probably done a better job at that than quarter-on-quarter. It's sort of the same thing as saying earnings and businesses should be run on a quarter-on-quarter profits basis rather than something longer term. So with that said, then let's get back to where we are forecasting more difficult times. For one, and this is a general comment then, we've never had an economic expansion where there's been no credit growth, no private sector credit growth. So to predict growth without credit is a very dicey little game, and indeed we've all predicted it, but I think in the beginning we were thinking, well, gee whiz, if there's no credit, then indeed growth will be slow. Well, we had no credit, we have had some growth, and it's way slower than any business cycle recovery that we've ever had in the past 50 or 60 years. So to some extent we had it right, but we haven't had the precision in the numbers just yet. Right. Secondly, I would say the European crisis, I mean, just to bring it up to date then and add yet one more uncertainty, the European crisis is important. While I don't really think it has specific economic negatives for the U.S., it certainly has had very dramatic impacts on European growth forecasts and certainly on market-related things. I mean, we would never have predicted that 10-year treasuries would go below 3% as long as GDP is running, let's say, close to 3%. Just you wouldn't have thought that, and yet it's true because the dollar and dollar investments like treasuries are a safe haven. So the markets are telling us that there's something amiss, and that's what we're starting to have to worry about as we make projections, say, for the second half of this year. Looks like growth does slow.
Brian, it's Michael McKee. Let me ask you a quick question about one of your forecasts, and that is for inflation. You see it going even below 1% in the next couple of quarters. How concerned are you about deflation and how all this will affect consumer psychology?
This is one of the forecasts that we've been very, very consistent on and confident in. We've been forecasting extremely low inflation, much lower than the Fed's forecasts and probably lower than most of the rest of the economists on the street. We do look for zero inflation in the second half of 2011, and we're talking now the not headline, but rather core inflation, the numbers that presumably the Fed is most interested in. So we're looking for zero at that time. Could it be less than? Sure, if it's a little bit more than, something plus or minus 0.5. I really don't care that much about that kind of difference, but just to get it down that low is a very, very significant forecast and a big risk from the standpoint of monetary policy.
Brian, I want to turn to employment for a moment, and not just the big picture on jobs, but also sort of the separation that we're seeing increasingly between the old and the young. And this is something that's different, that you're seeing more older people in the workforce and high teen unemployment. I mean, what does that say about the bigger jobs picture? Does that indicate some even more underlying concern?
It's not a good story. It really isn't. I mean, older people, first of all, the population is aging. The baby boomers are getting older, and consequently they are adding to the weight of people employed at the older end. That's just a fact of life. It's the baby boom generation, again, dominating economic and social statistics. But also consider that the baby boom generation, which presumably owns most of the wealth in this country, had a huge loss taken in 2007, 2008, and very little recovery so far since then. We lost about 23% of our net wealth. and that's a huge loss. And so for the people that were ready to retire or soon to go retiring, they basically had to make it up by staying at work longer and saving a little bit more. And that's, I think, one of the factors that's kept a lot of the older people in the job market for longer. Also, the Social Security benefits max out at a later age, and that probably is going to continue if and when the Congress ever gets around to actually doing something about mandatory spending. But then let's look at the younger generation. They're relatively less skilled, and it seems like, for the moment at least, the economy is just not creating new jobs, and so they're the losers in this game.
Brian, unfortunately, we're out of time. Brian Fabbri is Chief Economist of North America at BNP Paribas. Thank you so much for joining us.